Okay, so welcome. Wonderful to see you. And wonderful to have this privilege to talk about the bald eagle. I'm going to be jumping around in a playlist of videos that I've made, mostly using images and videos that I've taken in the past, many here from the Bashakil in previous years, as I'm participating in Nature Watch this year, hopefully adding to this, just in case anyone sees this and says, oh, I'd like to view that again because I'll be, doing the abridged version of this. My name is Dr. Walter Jan, and so my YouTube channel is Dr. Jan, DRJAHN 41. So if you type that YouTube and then look at the playlist or type Eagles, you'll get to here. If in case there's anything here, you see I teach a lot of classes for Orange County Community College, so you'll see a lot of stuff here. Even before we start, just this video I just kind of put up yesterday. One of the reasons we're doing this is because as we look throughout history, people, we use symbols. Very often we use natural emblems as symbols, and very often eagles. And so it has come to pass that the bald eagle specifically has come to be a symbol of the United States. Here you can, I mean, say about bison, but you can see clearly bald eagles are. And if you were to ask, well, how did that happen? The answer is, I just have footage in the back like Williamsburg, people firing cannon just for. In 1776, it became clear that the King George's coat of arms was going to come down from the Continental Congress, and something should go in its place. John Adams thought that, wait a minute, they're not going to approve this Declaration of Independence we just wrote unless we have a seal, a national seal. So he was kind of the idea, we better hurry up and pick a seal. Otherwise, we're not, they're not going to vote on this declaration. Well, he was wrong. They voted on the declaration. But it was July 4th, 1776, that it was decided that Adams, Jefferson, and Franklin should be the committee to pick the new seal and, pick the symbol for the country. But they differed. Benjamin Franklin thought it would be neat to have Moses in front of Pharaoh with the idea that Pharaoh would represent, King George III, et cetera. So that was his idea. Jefferson had something like that on one side, but then a medallion on the other side. He had two Roman brothers who would start the overthrow of Rome. With the idea that Rome was once again England. So anyway, they presented these ideas to the Continental Congress, and they put it on the desk and said no. And a year later, they started up a similar process to pick a seal, and they came up with an idea that had a Lady Liberty and a soldier on another side, and then the Continental Congress said no. And then it wasn't until 6 years later that then what would become and here's just where some of these decisions were being made in Philadelphia, that this became the national seal, where you see the bald eagle, the shield here, the olive branch, and the arrows, et cetera. So it took 6 years to get to this. Just a little bit of background, but then ever since then, the bald eagle has been a national symbol. Right, and you can see it on so many coins. Obviously, I'm born and raised in Philadelphia, so there were the Philadelphia Eagles, using it here. I was a scoutmaster, Eagle Scout. So clearly the bald eagle is a symbol, which means a great deal to us. I'd like to kind of shift gears and, being a biology teacher, talk about the biology of eagles, but just recognizing that we're having this conversation, and at least in some part, because of this. Now, here's a dinosaur and here's an eagle, and they never met. All right. And the point is that no dinosaur ever saw an eagle, that there are no groups of modern birds alive that the dinosaurs had. While dinosaurs saw birds, they are not the birds of today or even close. Those birds were much, much different. So all of the current raptors are more recent. And eagles are recent. But as a biologist, I'm going to say something I realize is annoying. I'm not quite sure how you tell what an eagle is, because an eagle isn't really a good biological bird. it would be a good biological word if once upon a time there were ancestral eagles that were the ancestors of all of the eagles alive today. And that's not the case. Instead, from the raptor hawk eagle group, a couple of them got really big separately, meaning that the golden eagles are really not that close, not more closely related to bald eagles than many of the hawks are. That their group of eagles had one ancestry, and they are often referred to as the booted eagles. So there's a lot of eagles alive today that if you were to look, oh, I just somewhere in this animation. So if you were to look at their legs, you've got feathers going all the way down to their feet. They are called the booted eagles. All right. They are not closely related to bald eagles. Bald eagles are sea eagles that don't have those feathers, because if you're going to be catching fish, you don't want your feathers always getting wet, especially if it's cold, etc. So the bald eagle is something called a sea eagle. And so that is a separate group. And I have, what subfamily, etc. If anyone cares. But once again, so bald eagles are not equally related to all eagles. They are sea eagles. And in fact, there is a white-tailed eagle of Eurasia where the immatures, that's the eagle that's most closely related to the bald eagle. And immatures, which look very different, as I will be getting to, we just had one a second ago. We'll see more immatures today. It says somewhere. Immature white-tailed eagles and immature bald eagles are very hard to distinguish between. So, yes, you had a question before we.
Actually, Walt, I think when you withdraw it, I was thinking about
okay.
The raptor that was in Central Park last year, but that was a Eurasian owl, wasn't?
Oh, I'm not familiar.
Flacco was like it got released from the Central Park Zoo. I mean, not purposefully, somebody didn't survive for a year. But anyway, that's not the same one.
Oh, okay. Well, look, feel free to. Oh, okay. So eagles are raptors, and once again, sorry to be annoying in biology, but once again, it would be neat if raptors were all related, and we could say, here's a real biological group. But the more we study them, we say, no, owls had, a separate ancestry, and then old world vultures and new world vultures, no, they're different. The new world vulture is more distantly related, and then we get into there's a current argument as to whether falcons actually belong in the group. So, we'd like to say, certain things even about raptors, but just physically, even if they're not really closely related, they share this predatory lifestyle with big talons, curved beaks, etc. Here's an osprey, which is easy to confuse for an eagle. One of the things you would look for is this dark brown eye stripe, the fact that the chest is all white, and until recently, in recent years, you could see both ospreys and eagles here. John Haas just said that the plethora of eagles that we have has kind of chased the ospreys away. But you would want to try to distinguish them in flight. Bald eagles just have huge wings. Huge wings. And so when you see wings this long, it's either an eagle or a vulture. And when you look at eagles, they are much more likely to hold their wings. Ooh, I just saw it. I'm sorry, I have so many videos I get lost. Hold their wings out straight. Oh, where? I just saw bald eagles in flight. Oh, there we go. Yeah. All right, somewhere. I've got videos on bald eagles flying where they will hold their wings out straight, whereas the vultures more in a V shape. Ospreys are neat, is right where their wrist area, they have a bit of a crook, an elbow. All right, so they have a bend in their wings. And so very often you get a view of an eagle flying overhead. And so there are ways of distinguishing between them and their closest relatives. Bald eagles are big. All right, now, by big, I mean they are the second largest flying birds in North America, with the condor being first. So here's the winner in that category. The condors out west. Bald eagles come second. They are slightly bigger than golden. So, I mean, they're really, really close. Nevertheless, bull's a little bit bigger. So here's a beautiful golden eagle. You'll see just a little bit smaller than a bull. There are other differences as well. Bald eagles have very big beaks. So that's a big beak, but bald eagles' beaks are thicker than that. So there's a number of differences here. But as far as how big bald eagles get, once again, obviously it would vary. Bald eagles, you can find them all throughout North America. And as you might imagine, with that big of a range, they're not all going to be the same size. So in northern areas, they're going to be bigger than southern. We see that with a lot of animals. So Alaskan bald eagles, they're bigger than Florida bald eagles by, a decent amount. Like, so an Alaskan bald eagle might have a wingspan of up to 8 feet, which is huge. Florida, you might be looking at more 6 feet. So that's a sizable difference. Also, females raptors are larger than males. And so how big is a bald eagle? Just because there's a gender difference, there's a geographic difference, obviously there's some variation here. And not only are females 25% larger than males, the depth of their bill, their talons are also a little bit larger as well. So with all things in nature, especially with animals which have such a big geographic range, there's not going to be one answer that this is how big they get or this. There's going to be some variation in these. But the second largest flying birds in North America, certainly that is significant. Now, I have lots of eagle pictures and lots of eagle videos. Most of these are from the Bashiko. And so, this video and that just from the Bashiko in previous years. Okay. What do eagles eat? Well, mostly fish. But getting back to what I just said, there's variation. I mean, just obviously, if you live in a huge continent, like, there are eagles in the Midwest. All right. So what are they eating in the Midwest? Well, that's going to be a little bit different from what they're eating along the Delaware, along the Bashikil, et cetera. So fish typically represent most of the diet. Now, even before we talk about things other than fish, what kind of fish? Well, where you are would depend. Like the fish you find in the Great Lakes are different from the fish you find in the Hudson versus in Florida. So are you feeding on cod in the North Atlantic? Are you feeding on catfish in Florida? So which species are most available would certainly vary. Your ability to feed on fish would also vary because if you live in the South, you can always feed on fish if you live near a pond. But in northern areas, water freezes. And if you're staying here, you have to eat something other than fish, all right? Because unless you're by a river. So if you live in this area, there are just magic places where in winter, not only can you see eagles, but you can see a lot of them because on cold days, it's the only running water you can find. So Forestburg and the Rio Dam there, it's a great place. And also along the Delaware where the Lackawaxen stream comes in. If you want to see eagles in February when it's frigid, that's the only water which isn't frozen. So all the eagles have to go there. And so not only can you see eagles, you can say, there's one, there's one. It's just a wonderful place there. And just here's a quick thing in our area, shad. All right, so fish sometimes change their availability. It's in about a month, they'll be swimming up in huge numbers up the Delaware and the Hudson, laying eggs and dying, most of them, not all of them, but most of them. And so this is right around the time when the eagles need food for their young. There's gazillions of fish swimming up the river and dying right in front of them just to float. And so shad will now make, here's shad in the Delaware. It is just, along the Delaware, this is such a great place, but the Delaware and the Hudson empty into the ocean where the shad are swimming up from, where other, eagles wouldn't have that. So even if you're eating fish, what fish you're eating certainly vary enormously here. They also eat things other than fish. I didn't appreciate that until recently. I saw an eagle going after a duck. It was a bufflehead, and they're big birds of prey. They'll eat anything that they can get. And so the duck was going underwater, but the eagle was just hovering. So when it came up to breathe, the eagle would go after it, would go down again. And so that duck was I don't know how it played out, but that was a tough thing going on. Yeah. They eat a lot of coots. They will go after nestlings of great blue herons. We were just having a discussion of whether the bald eagles went after nestlings of other bald eagles, but they can use as prey nestlings of other things. Even an occasional adult bald eagle, they can go after mammals such as rabbits, muskrats, squirrels, raccoons, and others, including cats and small dogs. This is rare, but nevertheless, they are opportunistic feeders, and they do eat carrion. Let me just finish the carrion question. Here, just by the way, this is a forest bird on a frigid day where all the water is frozen, but here's two eagles, and then there'll be an immature that pops in at one of these videos here from the same place. Now, vultures eat a lot of carrion. And then there's a raptor called the caracara that doesn't eat as much as vultures, but still eats a lot of carrion. Bald eagles and golden eagles, they're next. So they do eat a lot of carrion, which A, helps them in winter, all right, because now fish aren't available. But at the very end, when I talk about threats that bald eagles face, like if you're a rancher who's now trying to kill coyotes that are bothering your thing, and you put out like a dead carcass that you poison, all right, to kill the coyotes, you're going to get some bald eagles as well, because carrion is an important part of their diet, especially in winter. Yeah, I'm sorry, you had a question.
Yeah, it's exactly on point. We live on a lake,
Mhm.
and I guess it was 2 years ago, we saw 5 eagles in a row sitting on the ice,
Mhm.
all picking on a large dead thing that was red, and I'm guessing it's a fox.
Interesting. Yeah. So they are, once again, fish is their preferred diet, but they vary. And in the Midwest, here we have so many bodies of water around us, but in other parts of the country, there's less. And so, some of these other food items will make up a bigger percentage. So glad. I almost hit a bald eagle once because they're such big birds, as we'll get to. Taking off is not easy if you've got a 7-foot wingspan. And there was one on like deer by the side of the road, and I was just driving. It was close to the Bashacle. I think it was on the other side on 209. And I'm coming around a curve, and there's a dead deer. There was a big thing. All of a sudden, it's a bald eagle, but I'm going, whatever, 45. And then it decides it's going to take off, and fly in front of my car. I just missed it, but here it was on carrion, and that's just something that we're going to see every now. So a little of their life history. So they can stay here all winter, all right, because we do have the Delaware, we do have some places which stay, free of ice. But many of the eagles in our area, especially if it's their first years, they will then migrate. Now, they have such big wings that they are great at soaring. So if they can catch a thermal, which lets them rise, that they can actually just coast for hours, all right, and then just keep on going, maybe 2.5 miles, and then ride another thermal, and maybe just flap their wings a couple of times. Hawks do this as well, but the really long wings of eagles mean that it's harder for them to get started. They need a stronger thermal up than a hawk would, but they glide much farther than the hawk would. Because they love those thermals, on a really calm day, you might see eagles sitting still more, just because they would have to flap their wings more in order to fly and to save energy. On a really calm day, they might just say, I'm just going to perch mostly and do more of my flying in, once I have those thermals. One of the things I'll mention, the differences between immatures and adults. Immatures are actually a little bit bigger than adults, all right? They weigh about the same. That's an immature. The immatures, their wings are slightly longer and their tail is slightly longer, which means they fly a little bit differently. All right, so immatures are going to use thermals a little bit more than the adults do. So here you can see right here. Now, if they migrate, where do they go to? And once again, I would love to tell you this is what they do. The reality is, no, it varies. So if you were to say, let's take young eagles, which were banded in nest in Canada, where do they go? Well, they all go south, but where south? It varies over a little bit. How about the ones banded in New York? Some went, southwest, some went south, some went, north. All right. Well, how about the ones in Florida? They can go over here or over there. So there's no one set. Some birds are very good, like they will go from here to their winter grounds here. Eagles, especially in the Chesapeake, where will they migrate to, the young? It's almost random. So that was the aqua band. All right. It's almost random, the directions in which they fly. And in fact, when you look at where immatures will go, adults kind of know where they're going. They want to go from certain immatures. It's interesting. Where was the wind blowing? So that's a big determinant. Like, they leave the nest and now they're going to take off on their own and be independent. Where they end up, whatever the wind currents of the time, that has something to say with that. So we may keep eagles over the course of the year, or they may where they may migrate. But this varies a great deal, and sometimes even with age, whether they're adults or immature. Yes.
Why did the bald eagles in Chesapeake migrate south along the Chesapeake? I mean, I don't see a temperature.
So,
what is it like?
so I'm not sure. So in the Chesapeake, so this was just the gentleman who wrote this book was actually, it was like, he's actually one of the bird banders. This book, like they like climb trees into eagles' nests, and so yeah, sorry. But apparently, and the data going back to the Chesapeake, this was when they were looking at the effects of DDT. Like the nests in the Chesapeake were one of the first ones which all of a sudden stopped producing viable eggs. So they've been studied for a while. Even if they're not migrating, maybe touching on something that was raised today, there's only so many eagles that can stay in an area. So if you need a big territory for bald eagles and they raise too young, the young have to go somewhere, and that after a while they're not going to that area is going to maintain the same amount. And before the colonists came, and settled, North America, they said like Chesapeake had like maybe an eagle's nest per mile. And lately, when I kayak the Delaware on a really good day, I say, I'm seeing about one per mile. Like, that's about, so that may be about the density they have. And if everyone's producing like two offspring, for that reason, if that for none, for that only, the immatures would have to go somewhere else, because of a saturation question. And beyond that, just being in Philly all my life, lately, the winters have been quite mild, but when I was younger, like it was different. And so if, there's Chesapeake Bay, there's lakes and rivers, you could have a lot of, ice freezing. So it might vary per year. Bald eagle courtship is famous in that, the adults can just go, really, really high in the air. They lock talons and they dive together, only breaking free at the last moment, which, must be magnificent to watch. There have been bald eagles found dead on the ground with their talons still interlocked. So obviously, if that's going to be an aspect of your courtship, you have to know what you're doing, because you can mistime the, if you're hurtling towards the ground, at the disengagement. Bald eagles mate for life most of the time, and they can live 30 years. And so this is quite, an extensive commitment. If one of the eagles dies, the other one may find a new partner, although they may have to wait for the next year. And this is commonly seen in birds, that even though we say they mate for life, if there is a year where their mating isn't successful, where no young are fledged, they might, quote, divorce, to put human terms on it, and separate and then seek out new partners there. Now, mating for life doesn't necessarily mean faithful for life, because in many birds, eagles not so much, but it is still that if you were to look at the young and say, do they all have the same father? The answer is not necessarily, even though here's a couple that's together for decades and they're mating for life. Nevertheless, there are extra pair matings that can occur. Eagles, not so much, but like, ducks and songbirds are famous for this. But then there's lots of variation. In fact, I apologize. So I'm glad this is being recorded. So show how naive I am. But there's a word, and I'm not quite sure how to pronounce it, so I'm going to give it my best shot. Is it called thruples or thruples, where you have, instead of two individuals forming a couple, you have a three. All right. Well, anyway, apparently that's potentially a thing. But it can be with eagles as well. So it's unusual, but you can have a nest being attended by 3 adult eagles. Point just being, there's variations. Like when we learn, we'd love to say, here are the rules. Bald eagles do this and do this. But over the course of a continent with all of this variation, there are certainly variations. Bald eagle nests are the largest bird nests in the world. All right, so it's just wonderful that here at the Bashkill, and just we have this opportunity to see the second largest flying bird in North America, the largest bird nest in the world, etc. Where do they put them? Well, some birds can get used to people. Ospreys do. So like you can put like these posts near roads, etc., and ospreys where the fishing boats go out, and ospreys can nest there. Bald eagles, they tend to prefer their privacy, which is one of the reasons, getting to the drone question. The question came up earlier in training, like what happens if like drones are going after the eagles? Eagles don't like that. They'll fly away. And then you can stress where, like, especially if it's cold, those adults should be keeping the young warm or whatever. And the more you molest a nest, now they're wasting energy, but they're leaving the young abandoned, where they're more at risk of predators. They're leaving them cold. So it seems innocent enough. Like if you're trying to get close to an eagle's nest, but there's a real potential cost to those. On very rare occasions, they'll use man-made structures, but they prefer not to. They prefer big trees. Maybe not the tallest, but they want it to be robust, because once again, these nests, as I'll say in a second, they can weigh tons. All right, and so here's the nests at the Bashkill from. Actually, I lied. I was going to say previous year. No, this was earlier this year. So this was earlier this year. There was nests, birds at this nest from the boat launch. Hello, welcome. Have a seat. Yes. Oh. We're glad you got found. And so where do they pick a nest? Adults will defend a territory, more defense against older adults than immature. So I asked the question of John, and this is just my ignorance. He's the expert. But if there were eagles in an area, adults might tolerate an immature, in the case that maybe it was one of theirs from a previous year, et cetera, and should be more active in defending their nest against other adults. And what he and others have pointed out is the eagles here, they were letting other adults get very close to their nest in the previous weeks. And that was curious, because normally we see eagles defending nests here. Where would you put a nest? Well, you'd want good visibility. If you're living in the north where water freezes, near a stream that's running would be better than a lake which might be frozen, because then you'd have a smaller window to raise your young, right? Because if the ice is melting late in spring but freezing early, you need a certain window before your young are capable of flying. And if the water's freezing, you might not have enough of a window here. So here's eagles from the boat launch in a previous year, nursing or raising their young there. Also, as you look at the trees themselves, you want space, because if your wings are over 7 feet long, as you're coming in with some acceleration and trying to take off, just a tree that's not too crowded up at the top, obviously that is an advantage. So eagles typically reuse their nests, so they become bigger and bigger each year. And so it's not that uncommon that they just grow and grow until they will break the branch or the tree that they are in. One nest was used over 16 years and reached a size of 18 square feet. One weighed 2 tons and was 10 feet high. Obviously, not too many trees can withstand that, but every year they add more branches to it. The average nest, at least starting off, would be about 4 feet wide and 6 feet deep. We were just looking at a nest to see if there were an eagle in it, and there seemed to be, but it was just like this little bit of white popping up here and there. But once again, if it's, 4 or 5 feet deep, a bird could sit there on its eggs and you would only see its head when it was.
So question, if the lifespan can be 30 years,
Mhm.
for the nest that was used 60 years, that means.
Another pair, or maybe even one of the ones which was raised there. Yeah, so we see that a lot with birds, that like, where do you go, especially if you're a migrant, you tend to want to go back from where you were hatched. Like with ducks, females lead the males, and females will tend to go back to where their eggs where they were hatched as eggs. But then obviously you can see that this could saturate an area, and so then that raises all sorts of issues with that. Yes.
The nest building or refurbishing the nest every year at the Basheville, typically you can see that going on in January.
Mm-hmm.
See the adult eagles carrying sticks into the nest. So you got that right there.
Yeah, well, no, go on, go. But just in the background, this is from earlier this year. So this is earlier this year, bald eagles from the boat launch taking nesting material to refurbish the nest there. So go ahead. I just figured. And so they like sticks on the outside and like mosses and grasses on the inside where the young will be. And sometimes when it's cold, the eggs or the young can be covered with grass, just to try to keep a layer of warmth. But here, so this was earlier this year, from the bald eagles, right from the boat launch. Here you can see them taking material up to their nests.
And the most recent failure at that southern nest was, I believe Maureen and I were talking about, I think it was 2018.
Mm-hmm.
They had eggs in the nest, and then we had very frigid weather, but with winds.
I remember that year.
So
I do.
Winds came up under the nest.
Yeah.
Because birds can do okay with snow on top. You see photos of that, but it was the wind.
And there are so many variables. So just hypothetically, if you're an eagle, what do? Do you stay in this area, all right, and not migrate? There's an advantage. You'll be back at your nest first. So maybe there's an advantage, like you lay your eggs first, you're young at it, there's a thing here, as opposed to those who are migrating up from, say, Florida. They'll get back to the Basheville later. Maybe there's territories already established, et cetera. That's a disadvantage. But then if you've started earlier and you get this cold snap, maybe that affects you. So, as we look at, all of the wildlife trying all these different survival strategies, every year the weather's different, all of these different variations, sometimes this was a good idea, sometimes less so. Usually 2 eggs are laid. 1 to 3 are very common. On very rare occasions, 4 eggs. All right. So around the Chesapeake, they were noticing about 2% of nests could have 4 eggs in them. If you can imagine a tennis ball, which is a little stretched out, a little oblong, that would be about the size of a bald eagle nest. So right now we were seeing just a little white spot, I thought, and Jack thought, like above the top of the nest. This would be the time of the year that they're sitting on the eggs and maybe beginning to feed the first. But hatching date varies from late March to early May in the state of New York. And so, and so if you have groups which stayed here all winter and started a nest early, versus ones who are migrating in, there could be a bit of a window in between when the hatching is going on. Once the eggs are laid, especially at first, one of the 2 parents is there almost all of the time, 98% of the time. Once the young are older, it's less. So the chicks are at the nest by themselves for a while, but at first that almost never happens. The parent that's there often rotates the eggs, adjusting the nesting material, turning the eggs, warms them. It helps them later. The parent on the nest isn't as important for warming, but almost for shading, because if there's like intense sunlight, now the young, may be, warmed, and actually they'll kind of huddle in the shadow of the parent. So here you can see a bald eagle from the Bashville Nears Pass. Notice the snow, and so they would be important here. And then that was the second one I'll be talking about them and how hard it is to be a male bald eagle some days. We'll get to that in just a second. So the chicks hatch, okay, and they'll change their color. They're really dark at first, and then they'll get lighter as time goes on. Many birds regurgitate food for their young. Eagles don't. Eagles will just kind of gently place it in the mouths of their young. Now, eagles apparently have one mode where they want to really give food for their kids. Now, when the kids are really small, that means that they're bringing more fish to the nest than they need to. So if you were to look at around the nest of very young chicks, like the dead fish around the nest could actually outweigh the chicks just because the chicks aren't eating all that much. As the chicks get older, that's not the case. Now, all of us, I'm sure, have differing views of siblings, and so we don't need to pursue all of this. But how well you do in life might depend on whether you have siblings. So the ones which are laid first, they will tend to be larger. The ones which hatch last are smaller. And then females are larger than males. So when you look at chicks in a nest, there's different sizes there. The largest, typically the oldest ones, get fed first. All right. And if they're about the same size, which might happen if the firstborn was male and the secondborn was female, because females are a little bit, now there's more likely to be, some combat, but as they compete for this food. If there's an obvious size difference, the younger ones just tend to be submissive and just not take on their larger sibling. But that means that they're not getting as much food. Now, if there are only 2 chicks, there's probably going to be enough food and the second one will be just fine. But if there are 3 chicks, the third one might not make it. All right. So that kind of depends on how good of a year is it, like how easy it to get food. And if the third chick doesn't make it, it's not so much like a physical attack as much as just starving. All right. It just didn't get as much nutrients to get itself going. As the chicks get older, notice how dark the coloration is. We'll talk about immatures in just a second. But they'll get to the point where they can walk around the nest. And you saw it practicing its wing motions, because soon it's going to start to fly, and it's a big bird. And so it's going to need practice before it takes that first leap in order to get bigger. Now, a little bit into its development, it's gaining 6 hours a day. 6 ounces a day. This is the fastest growth rate known in birds. All right, so they're getting big faster. And as I'll mention in a second, very soon they're bigger than their father, which raises, an issue. All right, well, I'll just talk about that now. So the female is bigger than the male. And by the end, the young are bigger than the male. So what that means is that the male almost never gets to eat at the nest. All right, food is taken away from him. The female will kind of chase him away. So very often, while the female will, bring food to the nest and she eats at the nest, the male only eats when he's farther away. All right, so here by 8 weeks, the eaglets are fledging and getting up. And just so you know, with the time schedule we have, I think there might be a birthday party coming in at 2. So just to be just something that will be going on next door here. So okay, fair enough. Okay. I was at a karaoke last night where I was dressed as King George singing Hamilton. So putting on a mask is not a problem. So here you see some of the eagles, which are almost to the point where they are ready to leave the nest. Now, you might notice that eagle on in the middle there. It didn't look like a bald eagle. And that's because we often think of like the white head and the white tail. That's usually what we see around year 4 to 5. All right. So immature eagles look different. They're really dark when they first hatch. By the time they're leaving the nest, all right, they're okay. So I have a, all right. So in addition to the white head, which is obvious, notice the beak, how bright yellow it is. Notice the iris, how bright yellow it is. That is not how they start off. So if you look at these young in the nest, the beak is darker. The eyes are brown, so they don't look like the bald eagles that that we think of. If you look at them then in the time they're a year old, right? So look at the eye is dark. So this is an immature bald eagle. Look at the beak is not that bright yellow yet. Certainly we don't see a white head, although it's certainly lighter than it was. All right, so you look how it's a little beige up top. So this, you would know that this was not, something that had left the nest recently. This would be in the summer afterwards. All right, so here we are slightly older. It's easy to be confused. And just a quick point out, a lot of people in the past, when they were first exploring North America, they didn't know how many eagles they were looking at and like who belonged to what species because the immatures look different from the adults. John Audubon was not the largest fan of bald eagles. It just wasn't for whatever reason. But when he was on the West Coast, he fell in love with what he called the Washington eagle and spoke of its praise and described it as so notable. It was an immature bald. So, what he thought was two different species, he liked one and didn't like the other. It was just, the same species. Here you can see it now at, say, 2.5 years old. So you do not see a white head and tail, but you do see an awful lot of white. Now, this is why this is a stage at which you might confuse it for an osprey, because ospreys have more white on them. They also have that brown eye stripe. All right. And so, you have to be careful since the eagles change their shape over time. This is once again at the Bashik Hill in previous years of an immature there. All right.
Did you say that was 2 years?
Yeah. So yeah, that would be 2.5. Okay. Notice the adult near it. Adults are a bit more tolerant of the immatures, not to defending here. So here's on the Delaware. Once again, you'll see here's a bald eagle. You see all the white underneath, although it's not a solid white belly the way you would see. Notice a little white on the tail, but not completely white. You'll also see some brown. All right. Now this eagle just looks dirty, all right, but it's not. It's 3.5 years old. So here it is. It's starting to get more and more white, but not a completely white head. So you'll still see white on around the eyes. You'll still see white. All right, we'll see it up close in a second. So here it is. Notice, like you might think that's a dirty. No, it's just getting older. All right. So notice the beak is more yellow. All right, but not as yellow as it will be. Head is white, but not as white as it will be. And I don't know this for a fact, but if you were to ask what does a bird look like at like 4.5 years, so I don't know this for a fact, but if you look at, can you see a little brown in there? And right here at the neck, can you see a little, I'm sorry, that space bar wasn't there. If you could just look at, there's a little brown in there. So right when you're like 4.5, like it looks like a bald eagle, but if you were to look super close, you still might see a little more brown. But then after 5, you wouldn't see that. So here you can see here are 2 adult eagles and an immature in the same tree. Once again, in Forestburg, which is where this was taken, if you tend to be in a place that doesn't freeze, then you certainly have all of the advantages. Somewhere, I forget where I put it. Yeah, okay, I'm sorry. Then I did have a little text about the difficulties that the males face just being smaller. That was in there somewhere. Okay. Sure.
About for the immatures and sort of bigger, I'm curious about what contributes to their size difference. Like, are they just meteor?
A nice picture. I apologize. I kind of was making those for a lot of these videos were made in the past like 3 weeks, like for this presentation and for Nature Watch in general. And then there were things like, ooh, that would be a cool thing, but just I was budgeting time. One of the things in one of the books I saw is if you had an adult outline, and it had an immature behind it. They were the same size in the same way, but the wingtips, the feathers would be a little longer, and the tail was just a little longer. So I think it's the feathers, especially the wingtips and the tail, just a little fuller. So, and that affects how they fly and how they'll catch thermals and things like that.
Well, in 2011, there was only one eaglet in the nest, the southern nest that fledged, and it almost immediately was injured. And so, long story short, a group from the BKA rescued it over July 4th weekend, and Bill Streeter, people took it to Bill Streeter to the rehab center. It was a female, and she was, if I recall, 13 pounds. Anyway, she was released at the Bashville within about 4 weeks. But what he explained to us, and it kind of fits in with what you're saying, Walt, is that she was fully developed except for her wing muscle. So that would have been added weight once she was flying.
Interesting.
So, but he said.
So that makes sense that, like, while you're doing this in the wing, it's not the same as actually flying as far as building muscle mass. Interesting.
Really cool. Yeah.
Thank you. So I have a lot, but just looking at the time, maybe hit all of the highlights and then ask if there are any questions. We are so interested in preserving the eagles. And then obviously that implies that there are threats. So what are the threats? Unfortunately, a bunch. So let me just kind of give an overview of the bunch. One is obviously, as you know, people need to eat, and as people have spread out, we've certainly made a lifestyle out of hunting and living off the land, et cetera. Now, to some degree, we've done that to waterfowl, but eagles eat that. All right. We've essentially wiped out the bison, but especially in the Midwest, bison carrion was really important, especially in winter for bald eagles. And so, just hunting in general paid a price, but specifically hunting for eagles as well. All right. So there are lots of ideas that people have about nature, some of which are not correct, like owls. Owls have, for some people, like symbolize the harbinger of death and things like that. No, that's not it. And a lot of people like Benjamin Franklin, at least in this one letter, I don't want to take up time going off on this side. He was a little critical of bald eagles. John Audubon was a little critical of bald eagles, but a lot of people were. A lot of people felt that they would steal fish from ospreys as if they're birds of bad moral character, but also that they were bad for farms and they would like go after all of the pigs, etc. And I'm sure they would a little bit. But it was justified to then specifically go hunting for eagles, despite there being that they were the symbol of the country. And the state could pay you to shoot eagles. Colorado did. And the book I had mentioned earlier that I read, they just did a newspaper search for articles which included the text bald eagle shot, and they found over 180,000 of those. So just trying to make the case that this was not a rare event. And thus eagles started to become scarcer. But then there was the Bald Eagle Protection Act. So you couldn't just shoot eagles anymore, unless you were in Alaska. All right. And in Alaska, they felt that eagles competed for salmon. And by the 1950s, from 1940, over 128,000 eagles had been turned in for the bounty that the state of Alaska would pay. All right. So that's a lot of eagles. And, even after this illegal hunting certainly has persisted. And so many, depending on who you ask and where they are, between many and most of the eagles which are found dead have been shot, even though it's against the law. It still happens. There was this one study that wanted to study how many were being electrocuted by power lines. So they were looking at dead eagles by the power lines. Most of them had actually been shot and not electrocuted. The last breeding male bald eagle in New York State before they were successfully reintroduced in 1980 was shot. And between 1980 and 1983, between 200 and 300 eagles were killed near a wildlife refuge in South Dakota. Not only is it illegal to shoot them, but there's a wildlife refuge where hundreds of them are shot. And somewhere I swear somewhere, should be somewhere. But I think there was just, it was like 2 years ago that, there were a couple of people that they were just prosecuted for like shooting a gazillion birds, including bald eagles. So the fact that they are protected by law does not mean that the shooting has ended. But then there's many other threats. So this is just kind of the overview of all of them, and I'm going to get to the chemical ones last. So some of the deaths are accidental, where there are traps set for animals, maybe coyotes, which are bothering your livestock, or just you're part of the fur industry and you want to trap animals for fur. Eagles can get caught in the traps. Here are eagles in the Bashkill on the ground, right? So if there was a trap, set for an animal, obviously these eagles could get caught there. Some of those traps include poison, where you're trying to poison predators. Well, if you put out carrion, and the eagles feed on carrion, and especially in winter, and it's poison, well, obviously that can affect those as well. We've obviously changed the habitat. All right, we've drained so many wetlands that otherwise would have fish in them. We've cut down forests. And remember, eagles need big trees. All right, you can't make a nest unless you've got big trees. Well, 400 years ago, every tree was a big tree. I'm exaggerating, but like closer, every other tree would have been this wide. All right, but now trees which are big enough to support bald eagles, they're hard to come by. And even when we have lakes and rivers, once again, eagles don't like human encroachment. And so finding areas which are private enough. So here we are on the Great Lakes. All right, clearly there could be eagles nesting and feeding on the fish here, but once we build up the human population, that's going to be a problem. Eagles do fly into power lines. There are things you can do to limit that, like the spacing between the lines, et cetera. But that is a cost, which takes. Well, I heard you say that. Excellent. Yeah.
Based on.
Yeah. So I understand what you're saying. However, windmills are a risk to bald eagles. You have these huge structures which are flying around. The fastest ones can be flying at 200 miles an hour. If you're a bird trying to navigate this, especially if this is along a flyway, they can be a significant source of bird mortality. A little more so for golden eagles than for bald, just because most of these are in the Midwest. But as we try to limit climate change and expand where windmills are found to more coastal areas, this may start to affect bald eagles more. Now, there are things that you can do to mimic that. Lighting on the blades, having the blades move a little more slowly. But nevertheless, if we're listing all of the threats to bald eagles, in all honesty, windmills are on that list. I did something I shouldn't have done. Last year, I developed asthma for the first time. I'm trying to, figure out why. Well, one of the things, as climate change occurs, like allergies are worse and worse each year. All right. And then there was this. So here I am, and that's a bald eagle in the background. I was on the Delaware River, but some of you may start recognizing this. Last year, the wildfires from Canada, like that's not what the sky should look like. All right. And last year was the first time in my 57 years that I have asthma. So I'm thinking that, the extra pollen, the extra mold spores, and the extra, contaminants, that all of this had a factor. Well, there's an eagle's nest on the Delaware. Like the eagles are breathing this too. So as far as threats to bald eagles, certainly these have roles. Here on these eagle observation areas, you'll notice there's signs on one of them which says like, please do not disturb, because once again, we want the bald eagles on the nest, warming the eggs, feeding their young. And the more people get close, with our cars, it said like that sign said, cars, please drive slowly in Forestburg, because the more we disturb the bald eagles, the less there will be. All right, so those are some threats. But then some chemicals. All right, so let me just kind of run through some gamuts of some chemicals. The first being DDT. Now, I have opinions, I certainly should, but like I also then try to, to be fair, right? And to be fair, I have heard it said, and I you could make this argument that this DDT is a great chemical. And as much as I would like to protest that, the reality is that it was first discovered, its potential for a pesticide in 1939. Gentleman who discovered that was given the Nobel Prize for that. And if you ask why, well, the answer is there are things that I'm not worried about, like malaria and typhus. All right. But malaria is one of the major killers of the world. So the use of insecticides in the 1940s and the second half of the Second World War, shortly after that, it did save an incredible number of lives. Now, it started sowing the seeds for major problems which would pop up later. But at the time, DDT was hailed as this wonderful thing which was saving lives. And, in all fairness, I don't have to worry about catching malaria. And if I did, I might feel a little different. However, it was in 1947 that a gentleman named Charles Burley in the Chesapeake said these eagles' nests, they're just not being as successful as we thought before, and that was linked then to DDT. Rachel Carson wrote a book in 1962, Silent Spring, which really helped bring this to public awareness. 1962, when that book came out, the sale of DDT generated $500 million in the US alone, and 80 million pounds were used in the United States in its peak year, over £1 billion in 30 years. Now I'm going to leave this screen and go ahead, but as we're going to see, it doesn't go away. So the fact that all of this was, used in the past, as we'll get to in a second, that doesn't mean it's no longer with us. 400 years ago, where did bald eagles breed in North America? It would have looked like this. All of the United States except Hawaii, some northern Mexico, much here. If you were to go to the 1960s, like when I was a kid, this is where. I would have loved to have seen a bald eagle when I was a kid. I never did. All right. You couldn't. All right. There weren't any bald eagles here. All right. There weren't any bald eagles, along the Delaware. So the Chesapeake, yeah. Florida, yeah, some here, a little around the Great Lakes, but otherwise you're looking at the Northwest. So we had wiped the bald eagle out from most of its breeding range by the 1960s. Now the hunting had done all of that, but this was when the DDT was really starting to kick in, which is why the public awareness really was so important. And if you're asking why, a couple of reasons. One, it's non-polar, it doesn't mix in water, but that means it mixes in fat. And once it gets into the fat of your body, it doesn't leave. So if we were to look at the fat tissue that any of us have in our body, we would find pesticides which we ingested when we were kids. It came in and it hasn't left. All right. And that's true of bald eagles, that as they get older, the amount of pesticide in their body is going to build up because it gets in their fatty tissues and just stays. All right. And then also add to that, there's what's known as biomagnification. If we were to measure how much DDT, and what I'm about to say, the same thing is true of PCBs. If we were to ask how much is present in the water, it's a certain amount. How much in the little things which are filter feeding the water? It's more. All right. How much in the things which are eating the water bugs eating those things? More. The baby fish, more. Than the bigger fish, more. And then the things which eat the biggest, those more still. So biomagnification means that the things which are at most risk of pesticides are the things at the tops of food chains. That's bald eagles, but it's also us. So I'm going to say that a couple of times. We're worried about the bald eagles, but if it's hurting the bald eagles, it's not good for us either. And we should worry about it for ourselves as well. So DDT, DDT gets converted into something called DDE, a metabolite. It's still in most people. Most people have DDE in them, and most eagles do, right? Much less than in the past. But this is something that persists. It was banned in the 60s, right? But we still have it with us. PCBs are another chemical which were used in, whether it be the Great Lakes, the Hudson, etc. Here, because they're going to be starting, I think soon, I'm going to do a little accelerated version. And so it, had, great effects, in use of industrial products, but it turns out it causes cancer. It's a neurotoxin. It's an endocrine disruptor. It stays in the environment. Over 1 million tons had been produced globally. So it's still with us. It's still in the plastics which were created in that day, which are in landfills. All right. So even though it's been banned now, if these are old plastics, they have really bad toxins in them as they break down in the water. This continues to being released. If you go to Croton Park, um, which is closer to New York City, so it's here. It's a beautiful place to see eagles. Like that's where Eagle Fest occurs. Eagle Fest occurs in beautiful place, wonderful, wonderful. It's a landfill that has been covered over. Now it's sealed, but it has to be sealed because there's nasty stuff in there. So even though these things have been banned decades ago, not our generation, the next generation has to keep monitoring this to make sure that it doesn't get into the Hudson. So the future generations have to continue to monitor the trash of the past generations so that these things don't continue to contaminate. So PCBs are still in eagle tissues. All right, they've been banned, so it's going down, but these things persist. And then there's mercury. All right, so mercury is released when we, produce, batteries. When we do a number, when we get chlorine, like for our household uses, it releases mercury. And then also when we burn coal, and it travels. When this is released in the atmosphere, so the mercury pollution which you have could actually have come from the continent next door. All right, so this is not necessarily local. You could be very good with not producing mercury. Mercury gets converted into something called methyl mercury, all right, by attaching a methyl group. And that's another thing that now sticks in biological systems and undergoes biomagnification. All right. So, all right. So it gets into different fish, but I'll talk about mercury and fish in just a second. So, I give, here's where it's produced. Uh, the bald eagles, which have to worry about mercury, vary. Like there's a little less than salt water. So it's not like if you were to look at mercury levels in bald eagles, a little less near the coast, a little more inland. Lead is a problem. All right. Now, lead can come from so many places. All right. So, we certainly produce lead with all of these things. Specifically near oh yeah, and what I'm getting at is when I was a kid, because I'm old, lead was in gasoline. All right, so that like here's a neurotoxin, and every car was emitting. Now that was banned, but in the United States and the developed nations first. So when I went to South America in the 90s, here is a gas station where you say there's diesel, there's common gas, and there's the super gas, which is sin plomo. Sin plomo means unleaded. But notice, it's only the super expensive gas which is unleaded. The common gas still had lead. So even when it was banned in the United States, it was still being used elsewhere. Aviation fuel still has it. All right, fuel that you use for farm equipment still has lead in it, and you can use lead if for fishing. It can be the weights that you use. It can be used in the shot that you use for hunting. Now you might say, wait, if you're waterfowl shooting, don't they encourage you not to use lead? You use for waterfowl lead-free shot. Yes, that's true. However, if you're shooting for deer, you can still use lead. And eagles go for carrion. A piece of lead the size of a grain of rice is enough to kill a bald eagle. So if you use lead shot and you kill a deer, you leave the carcass. If there's just a little bit of lead, that can be enough for the bald eagle to die. I've read some recent things, some recent studies, which are up to a third of bald eagles have shown signs of acute lead poisoning. Right. So if you were to just look, it's like recent studies, 2022 studies published in Science. Almost half of the bald and golden eagles showed signs of chronic lead poisoning, and a third showed signs of acute lead poisoning. So just kind of tying it all together, and I'm talking about eagles, but hopefully all of us are thinking about ourselves in the back of our heads. If you say, is it safe to eat fish? Well, there are websites, like the EPA has websites. the New York EPA, the Pennsylvania EPA, the Departments of Health. They have websites where they rank. So don't just go and say, let me look at these places, and they'll say, by safe might vary. Like, are you pregnant? Are you a child? Are you elderly? Like, so, like, what safe might vary depending on who you are. But if you were to then say, oh, I don't know, let me go to, I don't know, New York, and go and say, are there safe places to eat? I mean, do this yourself. Don't take my word. Go for the website, and you'll say, no. Like, if you're pregnant, if you're a child, don't eat any fish from this body of water ever. If you're not in that sensitive population, some fish don't eat, some maybe once or twice a month, or etc. So just test for yourselves. There are fish advisories everywhere, and it varies from species to species. So, because some species, whether they're bottom feeding, etc., they might be more susceptible to lead, etc. So the point was, there are a lot of threats that eagles continue to face. We're so thrilled that we can see them now. When I was young, I couldn't. We're so thrilled that they were taken off the endangered species list. That doesn't mean they're safe. They still have DDTs and PCPs because these things persist. But we still make mercury because we burn coal. We're still producing lead, so much so that we're warning humans don't eat these fish. But obviously the eagles can't read these advisories. They are. All right. And so, a lot of these things just accumulate in their tissues and will get worse over time. So I just want to, just end by saying, when I was a kid, I wanted to see eagles, and it was impossible. All right, there were close to no nesting bald eagles east of the Mississippi River. Once again, like a few in Florida, a few on the Chesapeake, et cetera. But apart from that, just none. And the fact that here we're talking about like 3 bald eagle nests, it's like, just a stone's throw from here. Right. When I kayak on the Delaware, like, they're just, once again, every mile or so, I'm seeing an eagle. That is just incredible. So it's just so thrilling to have that, but especially with like our national symbol. But we've brought them back because we cared. Right. We recognized that they had threats and we acted to prevent them. And then, as I pointed out, they still face threats, and not just them. All right, but obviously those pollutants are affecting lots of the ecosystem, and including us. And so we obviously have brought the eagle back because we cared, and kudos to us for doing that. But not the time to end that vigilance and that interest, but to just build on that success. We can do good things, and just to keep doing it. So thank you so much for coming. If anyone has any questions, happy to field them. I'm not sure, but I think if there's another exit, I think just so we don't bother them, we'll leave this. Yeah.
Wonderful photos.
Thank Oh, you're welcome. You're welcome. Oh, no, thank you. And like I said, we had refreshments earlier. If there's still some more, help yourself.
Oh, there's still.